Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's Tuesday, April 6th, and we're going to be breaking down this 8-game main slate that we have over on DraftKings, and it's a good one. I am looking forward to today's slate, but if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and turn the notification bell as well. You know, the typical YouTube shenanigans. And if you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that. If you want to join the community, we have several hundred people, and if you want access to the projections, optimizer, ownership projections, rankings, cheat sheet, data sheets, all that fun stuff, stacks, Discord chat, all that good stuff. Link is down below for that. And if you want a free money bonus, up to $50 over on Monkey Knife Fight instant deposit match. Use code CPEN and tell them I sent you. Social media handles in the bottom right corner of your screen. And I kind of think that's it for the shameless plug. So without further ado, let's dive into today's video. And as per usual, we will start with the pitching. And yesterday's slate was not a good one for pitching on the surface, but a couple of guys that ended up pitching very well. Obviously, Jacob deGrom had a pretty decent game, but Dustin May and Carlos Rodon, who I thought would be the chalky SP2, and he was pretty chalky, they both had some really strong games. So as bad as I thought pitching could be, it actually wasn't terrible, the guys that were pretty popular. But this is a good pitching slate. We got a lot of good aces on the mound. We have Yu Darvish, Lucas Giolito, Tyler Glasnow, James Paxton, although he's not on their level, but I do think he's a nice SP2 in his price range. But some really good pitching options, and they're not overly expensive, and the bats today aren't overly expensive as well. So you can easily play like a Darvish, Lucas Giolito combo. Even easier, you could play a Giolito Glasnow combination. So I don't think you have to really dig down for cheap pitchers today. Even the Coors Field bats for Arizona are pretty cheap as well, and I think the Milwaukee-Chicago game is somewhat interesting, and they're not overly expensive. They're actually cheaper than they were yesterday for the most part, so pretty fun slate. You can kind of build whatever you want. When I was just kind of playing around with some early builds, not knowing lineups this morning. But anyway, we'll start up top with Yu Darvish, $10,000. He didn't have the greatest opening day start, but he's still one of the best pitchers in baseball. The San Francisco Giants have the lowest implied team total in the slate at 3.35. He's got a 65% chance for the win. He's a heavy favorite here. And his strikeout prop over in Vegas is 7.5, which is tied for the most on the slate with Tyler Glasnow. And his numbers last season were insane. I know, like I said, he didn't have the greatest start in the world, but it's only a one-game sample size, so I'm willing to look past that. He had over a 30% K rate last year. Really good control at 2.82 xFIP. Didn't allow much power whatsoever, and some overall very, very solid numbers. There's some decent hitters in the Giants lineup, but I'm not too scared of it overall. If you're looking at their splits last year versus righties, they didn't have a ton of power in the world, a 173 ISO, which is not terrible, but it's not like amazing either. It's not like the Dodgers out here. They didn't strike out too much, but Yu Darvish is a guy I'm not going to worry too much about strikeouts because he can easily pick up 10 in the start. 107 WRC plus, 328 WOBA, 261 batting average. Again, not terrible numbers, but I still think he's going to be fine here. If you want to roster him as your SP1, I have no issues with that. I'm not sure you have to play him in cash games because you could easily make a case for Giolito. I think Giolito's the best cash game pitcher on the slate with his matchup and his talent level. But outside of him, I think you're probably going to decide on either if you want to go Yu Darvish or Tyler Glasnow for your other pitcher. And then you're going to have to decide if you want to go cheaper with a James Paxton to really load up on some bats. So I think you can make a case for Darvish in any format here. I might be leaning towards GPP more so than cash just because of that price tag, and I feel like you can get similar production from cheaper pitchers like Tyler Glasnow, but I think he's fine in all formats. Then Lucas Giolito, $9,300 in a nice matchup here versus Seattle. A very similar implied team total for the Seattle Mariners at 3.45. Not as much of a favorite as Darvish, but still a 7 strikeout prop in Vegas, and he had his own fantastic numbers last year, and maybe not quite as good as Yu Darvish, but he had a good opening start here versus the Los Angeles Angels, which was a pretty tough matchup. Strikeout 8 there and went around 90 pitches, so we didn't have to worry about any pitch count issues. And this is a much easier matchup than the Los Angeles Angels. They have a great lineup over there, lots of good hitters, but Lucas Giolito should be the highest owned pitcher on the slate. I like the price point. He's an ace. He could honestly be priced close to $10,000, and I'd still have some interest here, so I think we're getting him a little bit cheaper than maybe he should be. But last year his numbers were very good, a 34% strikeout rate, a 3.35 xFIP. Walks are a bit an issue, a double-digit walk rate, which I never like to see on my pitcher, but as long as the strikeouts are there, he can make up for that. A 126 ISO given up, a batting average less than 200, a 310 slugging, a 257 WOBA, and only a 33% hard contact rate. So he kind of checks all the boxes for me. In this matchup versus the Mariners, it's a pretty good one. Now, they're worse versus lefties than they are versus righties, but even then, they still didn't have a lot of power last year, only a 146 ISO. 241 batting average, a .31 WOBA, and a 99 WRC plus with a 24% strikeout rate, which it's not terrible, but it's not like the most either. It's kind of just right in the middle where it's slightly good. But Lucas Giolito is a guy that I would not be surprised if he could rack up 7, 8 plus strikeouts here at $9,300. He is my overall SP1 in the slate when you factor in matchup, price tag, and talent. I like him a lot, and that's why he's the thumbnail of this video. And then dropping down to Tyler Glass now here at 9,100 bucks. I do like him quite a bit. He was very popular on opening day, and while he doesn't typically go too deep into games, you guys know how the Rays operate. He can still pick up strikeouts in a hurry, and Vegas isn't really too concerned about that. He has a 7.5 strikeout prop over in Vegas. Maybe he's going to go a little bit longer in this game than he did last time out, because on opening day he only went 77 pitches. If we could push that to the mid 80s, maybe even touch 90, which I know is asking a lot from the Rays, but he's got plenty of upside here versus Boston. Last year, his numbers were very good at 2.75 xFIP, 38% strikeout rate. Does walk some guys, which can get him into some trouble, but overall the numbers are all pretty good for Tyler Glass. Now, in this Boston team, besides yesterday, has been on a bit of a skid to start the season. I know they kind of got hot yesterday versus Michael Wacha, but Tyler Glass now is a much better pitcher than Michael Wacha, so I don't really have any concerns there. And I think you can make a case for wanting to play Tyler Glass now over Yu Darvish to save about $1,000 and get another extra good bat in your lineup. Now, the matchup versus Boston here, looking at their splits versus righties last season, it's not going to look great. They still have an ISO below 200, but the numbers aren't that bad. But still, I still think Tyler Glass now can overpower any lineup that he sees, so I'm a big fan of him here. And it's going to be interesting if I want to go Yu Darvish or Tyler Glass now paired with Lucas Giolito in cash games. I feel like maybe the more popular combo will be Darvish and Giolito if you can make that work. And if you can make that work, it'd probably make me feel a little bit better. But Tyler Glass now is a very interesting GPP option to pair with Giolito. But I'm still trying to figure out how that ownership is going to look right now. But I think you're kind of splitting hairs between those guys. 4.08 implied team total against him. Not the best pitcher's park in the world in Boston, but still, if the strikeouts are there, I wouldn't be surprised if he could push 7+ like he did in his last start versus the Miami Marlins. And then dropping down to the cheapest pitcher I have here, I don't personally think you have to go this low. And it's not really like you're going that low. James Paxton is still a very viable pitcher at 8,100 bucks. It's just the matchup sucks here versus Chicago White Sox because they have plenty of power versus lefty. Even though that Eloy Jimenez is not in the lineup and Tim Anderson is banged up, they still have some really good righty smashers like Jose Abreu. Yermin Mercedes looks like the next best thing now these days. I'm not sure why. Then Yasmani Grandal's there, Robert, some other guys. So it's not like a cakewalk matchup here, but James Paxton certainly has some strikeout upside, and if we can get a guy with around a 30% strikeout rate in that mid 8K range, or I should say the lower 8K range at 8,100 bucks, you'll definitely want to take some stabs at that. The velocity drop should no longer be an issue. I know last season the numbers don't look that great at 4.47 xFIP, close to a 30% strikeout rate, walk rate close to double digits as well, gave up plenty of power, which can be a bit of an issue here versus the White Sox, but I feel like he's going to be improved this year. I know I was reading up that the velocity should be no issue these days, and he did have a pretty good spring. The strikeouts were there, so that was an encouraging sign for James Paxton. And we know when he had that velocity, he was a great strikeout pitcher. I remember rostering him one day. I can't remember what year it was, but I want to say he had like 16 strikeouts. Not saying he's going to do that, but the strikeout upside is certainly there for Paxton. I like that price point quite a bit. I just hate the matchup here versus the White Sox. Last year's versus lefties, they absolutely crushed them. Didn't really strike out too much. Had a double-digit walk rate. ISO above 230, close to a 300 batting average, a 142 WRC plus, and close to a 400 WOBA. So they were one of the better teams in baseball versus left-handed pitching. So there is a lot of downside here for James Paxton, but if you want a cheap mid-range pitcher, James Paxton is certainly there with the strikeout upside. Now, he might give up a couple of homers, but if he can get like 6 to 8 strikeouts and not get absolutely shellacked with 4+ runs, it's not the worst play in the world at 8,100 bucks. But I don't personally think you have to go this low today. Now, again, we're not like we're digging down to the Carlos Rodons of the world, Michael Wacha's like we were yesterday. But the bats are kind of cheap. You can make a full-on core stack of the Arizona Diamondbacks today and play Yu Darvish and Lucas Giolito. It's really not that hard. You have to load up on a lot of sub 3K bats. You can just make a nice 3K lineup with a couple of 4K guys and play Darvish and Giolito together, and it really isn't too much of an issue as of right now. We'll see how lineups shake out, but I don't really think you're going to have to go super cheap today. But if you need to go to James Paxton, probably not the worst thing in the world, but I really do prefer just getting a couple of either 9K pitchers or a 9K guy plus Yu Darvish today. But that's kind of it for the pitching for the most part. Really good pitching slate, like I mentioned. We got 4 really good pitchers here that pique my interest. All have around a 30% strikeout rate or more. So yeah, it should be fun to watch these guys on the mound tonight. But I think with that being said, we can move on to the bets. Alright, so we'll start up top with the catcher position. If you want to spend up, I'm probably going to end up spending down once again, but we have Wilson Contreras at $4,900. He went deep last night and actually finally started the scoring for the Chicago Cubs because that game was just a pitcher's duel between Brett Anderson and Trevor Williams for a while. And I was getting a little bit frustrated because that was like one of my top game stacks of the day, and I know it was for a lot of people because when I was looking at the ownership, I thought they'd be popular, but these guys were like all 40 to 60% owned. Obviously, Al Garcia was around 60%. Castanera was around 60%. Christian Yelich was around 60%. Bryant was around 40%. Javier Baez was actually pretty low and actually went deep, but it was a very, very, very chalky game. Even Omar Narvaez was around 40%. I thought the ownership was a little bit crazy there, but I mean, I was all with them, but I wasn't. I was kind of surprised they were that high owned. But anyway, Wilson Contreras here versus Freddie Peralta. Freddie Peralta had some pretty good numbers last year, so I'm kind of a little bit nervous here because looking at his splits versus lefties and righties, well, overall, we'll just look at the overall stats. He had a 3.23 xFIP, 38% strikeout rate, can walk some guys, didn't give up too much power either, does have a nice fly ball rate. So the wind is once again supposed to blow out in Wrigley Field around 10 miles per hour. It's nothing too crazy, and we saw that yesterday where the Cubs total wasn't super high. It was sitting around 5, and typically if we see the wind blowing out to a decent degree, we could see that approaching 6 or more, so Vegas wasn't like overly concerned about the wind, but Anderson was a big ground ball pitcher. Freddie Peralta, he will give up quite a bit of fly balls, 43% fly ball rate. Not a lot of home runs per 9 innings, but if the Cubs can get a hold of the ball here, they should be able to at least do a little bit of damage. So I do think they're an interesting stack today, but I'm a little bit more interested on the Milwaukee Brewers side of this game than I am the Cubs, but the Cubs are still viable with the wind blowing out in Wrigley again. Nothing overly impactful, I don't think, but it's at least a little bit helpful to hitters. And last year, Wilson Contreras was better versus righties than he was versus lefties. But if you're spending up, he's a fine option, but I'm going to personally find myself spending down for the most part at catcher today. Stephen Vogt, $3,200, should crack the lineup here versus a righty in German Marquez, who did get beat up a little bit in Coors Field in his first start of the season. But one thing I want to mention with the weather in Coors Field, it looks like it's going to be pretty chilly there, around 50 degrees, and the wind's supposed to be blowing in around 15 miles per hour. So while we're still in Coors Field, it need to be favorable to hitters in this game. And I'm kind of surprised the Diamondbacks only have a team total of 5.09 because we are in Coors Field, and that's actually pretty low for a Coors Field run line. But the way the weather is, I think that's having something to do with it. Plus, German Marquez is not the worst pitcher in the world, and the Arizona Diamondbacks aren't the best offense out there. But the weather is something to definitely look at. If the weather was just fine like it was for the Dodgers series, where it was around 70 degrees and sunny every day, and the wind wasn't too much of an issue, Diamondbacks are easily the best stack on the slate, especially at their price points, because they're not really priced like they're in Coors Field. You can look down the list right now. These guys are all kind of below 4K for the most part. I still think they're a pretty good stack because of the price point, and it's still Coors Field, but it is going to be a little bit chilly and that wind is blowing in, so it's certainly something to look at. But I always prefer lefties versus Marquez, and Stephen Vogt has better power versus righties, so I think he makes sense at that price point. Then Omar Narvaez, he got the scoring started for the Milwaukee Brewers last night, which I was thankful for because I did own him quite a bit, but still didn't really help the rest of my lineup because I had a Hira everywhere, had Christian Yelich. Those guys did absolutely nothing, unfortunately, but I do think they can bounce back here versus the Cubs. They have a righty on the mound, and I do like the lefties here for the Milwaukee Brewers. You can play the righties as well, but for the most part, I do prefer the lefties, and Omar Narvaez is always viable versus righties, as he does have some pretty decent numbers versus them over the past couple of seasons. So $2,700 for one of the better stacks in the entire slate. I think there's no run line out yet for the Milwaukee Brewers or the Chicago Cubs because Vegas typically likes to wait a little bit, see what the weather's looking like, but with the wind blowing out a little bit, wouldn't be surprised if we see the Milwaukee Brewers sitting on a 5 implied team total, which is good enough for me at their pretty cheap price points. And then dropping down to first base, if you want to spend up, I do think Anthony Rizzo is fine, but I'm going to find myself more than likely spending down at first base today just because I don't think it's the greatest position today. You could also play Keston Hiura. He's eligible at first base, and Jake Cronenworth, but if you are doing a Cub stack, Anthony Rizzo makes sense. We know he has plenty of power versus righties, and I already talked about Freddie Peralta and all that stuff, so I'll save you the time there. But Rizzo would make sense as long as that wind is blowing out. CJ Cron, $3,700. I know there's a righty on the mound, and I always prefer CJ Cron versus lefties. But Luke Weaver, he's not a guy that I am going to be too scared of on the mound in Coors Field. He doesn't typically miss a lot of bats either. If we're going to pull up his statistics from last season, he had a 23% K rate, but a 6.58 ERA paired with a 5.06 xFIP. Close to double-digit walk rate, a 231 ISO, 292 batting average, 523 slugging, a 48% fly ball rate, 40% hard contact rate, and I like those hard contact rates, especially in Coors Field. I know the weather isn't looking exactly great, but it's still Coors. We're in elevation, and you can't take that away from us. So CJ Cron, he's a viable option at $3,700, and the Colorado Rockies do have a team total of 5.41, which is currently the highest on the slate. He's not overly expensive as well. We know he has some pop in his bat. Looking at last year's numbers, he had a 357 ISO, 138 WRC plus, low batting average, but he's got plenty of pop in his bat, so I think he is certainly viable. And then if you want a really cheap option, he's also eligible in the outfield as well. But it's Ronald Guzman here at $2,600 going up against Tanner Roark. And Ronald Guzman, he's not typically a guy I roster too much. He does strike out a ton, but versus righties, he does have some decent power there. A 349 WOBA last season, 122 WRC plus, and a 200 ISO, 28% K rate, but I guess you're just going to have to live with that at that price point. But looking at Tanner Roark's numbers last season versus lefties, There's certainly some upside here. He gave up a near 200 ISO, a 5.18 xFIP, and a near 6 ERA with a 14% walk rate. So Guzman, he's a fine cheap play if you're going to go home run hunting at that price point. And then dropping down to Keston here at $4,000. He was one of my favorite plays on the slate yesterday, and we all saw how that went. The Milwaukee Brewers for a while, they just could not get a hit off of Williams. But I'm willing to go back to the well here. The wind's supposed to be blowing out once again. Albert Alzolay, it's not a pitcher that puts too much fear into me. I know the Brewers really suck versus righties right now, but I still think they are all viable options. They're all a bit cheaper for the most part. And Keston here is a guy shown over the past couple of seasons that he can have plenty of power versus right-handed hitting. Now, he strikes out quite a bit. He had a 34% K rate last year, and he is not having a good start to the season so far, but I like all the Brewers here for the most part. Wind is blowing out. That's going to be a plus for hitting here. The price point's fine. I feel like their team total is going to be closer to 5 today, so I can definitely get behind a Milwaukee Brewers stack once again. Then right below him, we have Jake Cronenworth, who's also eligible at first base as well. He led off last night versus a righty. He should be hitting near the top of the order, whether it's first, second, or maybe even inside the top 5. But either way, he is a fine option here. He's going up against Aaron Sanchez, who's not pitched at the major league level since 2019 as he had shoulder surgery. So I think we can certainly look at Jake Cronenworth. Last year, the rookie, his numbers were excellent versus right-handed pitching last season. A 403 WOBA, a 316 batting average with a 265 ISO and a 156 WRC plus, and only a 12% strikeout rate as well. So Cronenworth, totally fine at that price point. Also eligible at multiple positions, which should boost his ownership up a little bit because it's easier to fit him in. Colton Wong, $300. He was pretty popular last night. His price got a little bit lower here. Should still be leading off versus the righty on the mound in Chicago. The wind's blowing out. I do like the Brewers stack today. I know they sucked last night, but I'm willing to go back to the well. I'm hoping that's going to drop their ownership a little bit. Not saying they're my absolute favorite stack on the slate, but they're certainly up there when you factor in the price tag. Wind blowing out, whoever's on the mound for Chicago, which is a righty, and all these lefties get boosted up a little bit. So Wong, not a guy that's going to strike out too much. Not a lot of power in his bat, but he can make contact, and as long as he can get on base a couple of times, hopefully get a run or something, that's fine enough at his $3,300 price point. Then dropping down to third base, he's also eligible at first base. There's a lot of guys that I think that are first base eligible in this video. We have Broseu, Jake Cronenworth, Hira, Guzman, CJ Croney, and Anthony Rizzo. So it's looking like it's a pretty good position today, but for the most part, these guys aren't overly expensive, but he had great numbers last year versus lefties, and we're going to have Martin Perez on the mound for Boston. He's not the greatest pitcher in the world, but looking at Broseu's numbers last year versus lefties, they were pretty darn good. It was only a 47 plate appearance sample size, but the year before that, he was good versus lefties as well. But a 333 batting average, a 455 WOBA, a 405 ISO, a WRC close to 200, a 750 slugging, OPS over 1,000. Did strike out quite a bit, and that whole Rays lineup does strike out a lot, but still, I think he's a really solid option for power. And I do want to go back to the Rays. I know the Rays, like the Brewers last night, absolutely sucked versus Nick Pivetta, but I still think they're one of the better stacks here. They have an implied team total close to 5, and I'm willing to go right back to the well here versus a lefty. And then Eduardo Escobar, also eligible at second base. He's just a guy just to get cheap Coors exposure. He does not have a lot of power in his bat, and overall doesn't profile out as the best player in the world. He also should be hitting a little bit lower in the order, but if you want cheap Coors exposure, he's there. He's also a switch hitter, so he'll have the platoon advantage versus German Marquez. Yandy Diaz, he's a nice part of that Rays stack that I do like today. He's a righty, so he's going to have that righty on lefty matchup versus Martin Perez, who's not a big strikeout pitcher. And Yandy Diaz doesn't really strike out much either. He's like the one guy in that lineup that at least keeps their strikeout rate being above 30% for the entire lineup, because last year he only had a 12% strikeout rate and a close to a 20% walk rate as well, which is a very good ratio, especially compared to everybody else in that lineup. Now, the problem is he's a big ground ball guy. He had a 66% ground ball rate last year compared to an 11% fly ball rate, but still had a 307 batting average overall. But if you want to just look at lefties specifically, he had a 444 on base percentage, a 355 WOBA. Still a lot of power, which is weird because when you look at him, he's a monster of a man. He's got the biggest arms I've ever seen, so it's weird that he doesn't have that much power, but still batting cleanup, projected to at least, versus lefty on the mound for a stack that I like quite a bit. I think he makes plenty of sense at that cheaper price point. Then going down to shortstop, we have Trevor Story at $5,400. The Rockies currently have the highest implied team total on the slate. They're in Coors Field. Luke Weaver allows a lot of hard contact, and Trevor Story has elite numbers versus both lefties and righties. So if you are stacking up the Rockies, or you just have extra money at shortstop, which is usually a position I spend up for, not sure I'm going to today because we do have a cheap Josh Rojas who could be leading off versus a righty in Coors Field. But Trevor Story, he's got all the power in the world. He's also got some speed as well. If you have the money for him, it's a great play. If not, I don't think it's too big of a deal. Then Willy Adames here, just part of that Rays stack that I do like. I like all those righties versus Martin Perez. You can play the lefties as well, but he did strike out quite a bit versus left-handed pitching last year. But besides that, his overall numbers are very good. Close to a 400 on base percentage, an OPS close to 1,000, 173 WRC plus, a WOBA of over 400, and a 319 batting average. Doesn't really hit near the top of the order, but I still think he's a decent piece of that Rays stack. Then Josh Rojas, $3,900. If he's leading off in Coors Field versus a righty, I think he makes all the sense in the world. Looking at his splits versus right-handed pitching last season, only a 41 plate appearance sample size, but it was absolutely terrible. But he's going to be leading off in Coors Field. I will certainly have interest no matter what his numbers are, and I always do prefer lefties versus German Marquez anyway. Then dropping down to the outfield, we have Christian Yelich at $5,400. He was around 60% owned in cash games yesterday. It might not be quite that level once again, but I still think he's going to be pretty popular. He does great out as one of the better plays on the slate for me, facing a righty in Chicago with the wind blowing out. I know they sucked last night, but you have to have a short memory in DFS. I'm willing to go right back to the well here on these Brewers, one of my favorite stacks in the entire slate. His numbers last year sucked. He struck out a ton and only had a batting average of around 205. Still had some decent power numbers, but the strikeouts are certainly concerning. But I still like Yelich here. I like all the Brewers, so I had to like their best player. Charlie Blackmon, $5,200. He's in the team with the highest implied team total currently, facing a pitcher that had a lot of hard contact last year, and we're in Coors Field, and he crushes lefties and righties, so Blackmon makes all the sense in the world. Similar to Yelich, where I like all the Brewers, I like most of the Rockies, where I know we haven't talked a lot about the Rockies players today, but I do think the entire lineup is playable, so I have to like their best player, which I guess could be a toss-up with him or Trevor Story. I used to be able to throw Nolan Arenado in the mix in there as well, but Charlie Blackmon, obviously an elite player in that lineup. And then Randy Arozarena, he was amazing the end last year, absolutely on fire, one of the best stretches I have seen. Is he going to hit that well every single year, every single season? No, but looking at the small numbers that we have last year in a 78 plate appearance sample size, he had a 422 WOBA, 176 WRC plus, and an ISO of 359. If you want to expand that to lefties, which is even a smaller sample size, only 23 plate appearances, they got even better. A 400 batting average, a WOBA of near 600, a 600 ISO, and a WRC plus close to 300 with only an 8.7% K rate compared to a 30 plus K rate that he had versus righty. So is he going to hit that well? No, but he's still a viable option here. I know he's a bit expensive, but if you are stacking the Rays, it's kind of hard to leave him. It's kind of hard to leave him off a full stack as he has all the upside in the world. Ketel Marte, $4,600. He got off to a good start this season versus some pretty decent pitchers in Blake Snell, Yu Darvish, and some other guys. But I like him here in Coors Field versus German Marquez. The price has come up certainly. He's no longer eligible at second base as well. But if you are stacking up the Diamondbacks, he's pretty much their best hitter, so it would make sense to leave him off. Don't think you have to get there in cash games, but if you're playing tournaments and you are full stacking the Diamondbacks, obviously he would be a decent way to go just to fill him in. Joey Gallo, $4,200 going up against Tanner Roark. I kind of mentioned this already with Ronald Guzman, but Tanner Roark was the guy that really struggled versus left-handed bats last year, and we know Joey Gallo's got some of the best power in the entire league. I know his numbers weren't super impressive last year. Overall, he had a 35% K rate, only a 197 ISO, and that's pretty good, but for Joey Gallo, we typically see that higher, only a 181 batting average. We know it's kind of all or nothing with Gallo. He will walk quite a bit, and he has a ton of fly balls. When he hits home runs, they're typically moonshots, and they're actually really, really nice to see. But if he can get a hold of one here from Tanner Roark, I think there's a decent chance of a home run for Joey Gallo. Not a big fan of the Texas Rangers today, but a couple of these guys are fine as one-offs for power upside. Then going back to the Chicago-Milwaukee game, we have Jock Peterson at $3,800. He had a really good spring, and we know he's a righty crusher. We can't play him versus lefties, but versus righties, he's always had really good power, and Freddie Peralta is a big fly ball guy. So if the wind is blowing out and Jock Peterson get a hold of one right, I think there's a decent chance Jock Peterson could go deep in this game. I like that price point as well. And if you're stacking up the Cubs or just stacking up this game in general, Peterson's a really nice mid-range play. And he's one of the cheaper Cubs that we have available as well. So if you're a little bit nervous about playing Cubs and you don't want to spend top dollar for guys like Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, Javier Baez, and Wilson Contreras, Jock Peterson's in that really nice price range where you can make that fit. David Peralta, again, just Coors Field exposure. I hate to sound like a broken record here, but they're in Coors, so they're playable, and they're all cheap as well. Usually, teams are very expensive in Coors Field, and DraftKings did this last year where the Arizona Diamondbacks were absolutely free every single game they were in Coors Field, so you could just kind of play them, and they're all super, super chalk. I don't think this is the same situation where I'm as excited to play them as I was last time around because there's a little bit different circumstances. The weather doesn't look as great. The wind's blowing in. I realize it's Coors Field, but it's still not the most exciting lineup out there, but totally viable if you want to play them in cash games. No issues with that whatsoever, but I don't think there's an absolute must-play stack today, and Vegas would agree. Only a 5 implied team total, and I could easily go over that because it's Coors Field, but I'm not insanely excited about them today. Then Ryan Maltapia, same game, just on the other team. We have him leading off here versus Luke Weaver, who did a lot of hard contact last year. Now, Tapia is more of a batting average guy rather than a power guy, but If he can get on base a few times and get some runs, $3,400 is not a bad price point for a guy leading off with the team with the highest implied team total on the slate at this moment. Pennell Margot, $3,900. This is just getting more exposure to the Tampa Bay Rays stack that I do like quite a bit. He should be leading off here versus a lefty. And Martin Perez is a low strikeout guy, does allow quite a bit of contact. Maybe not the most power in the world, but Margot is certainly viable here just as a lead-up option for a stack that I like quite a bit. Then Avisail Garcia, if you need to go really cheap, he's $2,900 going up against a righty in Chicago with the wind expected to be blowing out. Now, I like him better versus lefties. His splits do drop off quite a bit versus righties, but if you are stacking up the Brewers, I mean, he should be hitting cleanup, and I don't really want to leave him off a stack. I don't think he's going to be 60% owned, once again, like he was in cash games. He didn't have the greatest game yesterday. I still think he got on base. I want to say he had a single and a run, which was around 5 points, which isn't terrible at his price point, but I mean, you'd always want a little bit more, but totally viable if you are stacking up the Brewers. You could play them as a one-off as well, but not super exciting one-off in my opinion. But I think with that being said, guys, that's going to be it for this video. So I hope it was helpful, and if it was, make sure you leave a like. If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. Get me close to 8,000 subscribers. We are closing in on that soon, so I do appreciate the support with that. If you want to sign up over on Patreon, get access to the optimizer, projections, ownership rankings, all that fun stuff, cheat sheets, data sheets, Discord community, and all the statistics you want in baseball. I have seriously everything on here that you'd ever want. Link is down below for that. But with that being said, guys, I'm going to get out of here. I'll stop rambling. Hope wherever you live, the weather is wonderful, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.